Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Christ MotoGP podcast. And we're here to discuss the world champions, Ducati. When you look at it on the surface, it's been another dominant year when you look at the stats. But when you look at the breakdown of who's been doing the winning for the Borgo Panigale factory, it's clear it's Marc Marquez. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. He has done the heavy lifting this year for the Italian brand. And it's quite stark when you look at the difference between 24 to 25. The numbers are still there, but yeah, we're here to discuss what lies ahead for the champions in 26. Joining me, Jordan Morland as ever, is Pete McLaren and Lewis Duncan. And Pete, 25, what way would you think Ducati will view it? As a vintage year or as a, thank God we have Marc Marquez year?
Yeah. I'm sure they want to present it as a vintage year, and obviously, if you look at the number of wins and a Ducati next to its, the tally of first places, it looks great. But the reality is that Marc has dominated a lot of those wins, hasn't he? And we saw at the end of the year, we got the sort of the glimpse of how might the season have looked without Marc. And suddenly, from that sort of total dominance that there had been, they won one Grand Prix in the last four. So it was a big change. We did see some other, obviously, Alex Marquez was there, Digia was there, stepping up a bit. But Alex Marquez winning at Sepang, that was the one win, I suppose we should say, obviously on the year-old bike again. So, we still saw Pecco Bagnaia's problems continued, which also, I suppose, was interesting in that one of the theories behind this sort of mysterious season that he's had has been, is it being sat next to Marc Marquez? So, just psychologically, it was that a problem? And yet we saw even when Marc wasn't there at the end of the year, the results didn't really change, did they? They were the same sort of up and down and almost random as they'd been the previous 6 rounds. So, that explanation sort of maybe doesn't really sum it up. But yeah, for Ducati as a whole, if you look at the whole season, dominance, winning the World Championship, 1-2 for the Marquez brothers, fantastic result, triple crown, everything. It ticks all the boxes, but, certainly it was heavily dependent on Marc Marquez, wasn't it? And the end of the year, the Aprilia's winning those races as well. It does raise questions for the following year. So, I think there's work to do. I mean, and in fairness, the concession system, we should say, it's designed to do this, isn't it? It's designed to sort of slow down the people at the top and help those that are catching up. We've seen Honda move up a place, but of course, Aprilia and KTM, they're not on the same concessions band as Ducati, are they? So they do have more advantages there, with the clear aim of closing the gap. So I suppose it's maybe taken a little bit longer than we thought for the concessions to have an impact on the results. But certainly I think you've heard words from Ducati in these final rounds about the concession system. They've been a little bit louder on it, haven't they? That the other teams have been able to test more and everything else. And so maybe it's inevitable that this would happen at some stage. But certainly it was stark, wasn't it? The pre-Marc Marquez injury results and the post-Marc Marquez injury results.
Yeah, it's strange because I had to think about it at the weekend because I was thinking, did this actually start last year in the middle of it all? Because there was such a heightened title fight between they're not the same team, Martin and Bagnaia. Maybe this was the point, Lewis, where they kind of took their eye off the ball for 25, even though they had secured Marc Marquez. That was number one goal probably when you look at the season for the factory team, but. Could you imagine when we were sat in February when we were looking at test results thinking it would be this heavily weighted, Marc versus the rest of the Ducatis?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, Jordan. Ducati, we heard a lot last year about they brought a new chassis that Pecco wanted to race. He really liked it. And Ducati were like, no, we can't produce enough components to give to both factory riders, him and Martin in the title fights. They wanted to keep that fair. And then, of course, the only factory state riders they had were the 2 factory team bikes, and Pramac. Pramac, of course, leaving at the end of the year. Mm-hmm. There's less of an impetus to give a team new parts to take to a different manufacturer to give some data on, and likewise Martin as well. I think even at that point, Aprilia was one of those manufacturers that Ducati would have had one eye on as being a potential problem, and so. Yeah, maybe Ducati did take its eye off the ball. I think this year as well, it started the season off so strongly that it didn't really pull that many tricks out of the toy box in terms of developments. We had slightly different chassis, slightly different aero, but nothing radical. Not certainly to the same degree as we saw with Aprilia or some of the other manufacturers, some of the concession manufacturers like Honda, for example. So I think inevitably you do become a bit of a victim of your own success. There is a finite window with which you can improve, but equally, when you are in such a dominant position with a big rule change on the horizon as well, you do have a bit more freedom with resource management, and I suspect Ducati has kind of fallen into that trap a little bit of, we were so far ahead last year. Nobody's going to catch up to us this year. And to be fair, nobody did catch up to them. I mean, we talk about the difference Marc made. Had Marc not been there the whole season, Ducati still win the championship with Alex Marquez. You look at all those races where Alex Marquez was second. Okay, so that's Alex Marquez wins. So all of a sudden he goes from 3 Grand Prix wins to what? 5, 6, maybe even a few more than that. Definitely more sprint victories as well. There was the championship was always a guarantee. It's just, I think, with Marc at the factory team weighting things so heavily in his favour, and the stark struggles of Pecco Bagnaia. I think if Pecco had a similar season to last year, but maybe with less wins, or was just on the podium every weekend, I don't think we would have seen as, we wouldn't have viewed, I think, Ducati's kind of being pegged back a little bit by its rivals as being such a big thing. But I think because of what's gone on with Pecco, I think it's magnified something, perhaps to a degree that's not quite true. I think 100% Aprilia are coming. I think Honda are getting there. I think KTM, if they can just carry on what they're doing and give Acosta a good bike for next year, I think the gap will close. But we missed Marc Marquez for the last 5 rounds. And we haven't really seen the best of Marc Marquez since before Japan. Yeah. Really. So you look at that, you look at the way the bike was. Is that going to change going to next year? I don't think so, really. I think Ducati will have a bit more awareness about its rivals and about its standing. I don't see there being this massive shift, though, because we forget how dominant Ducati was last year. 19 out of 20 wins, podiums in every single sprint. 14 all Ducati lockout podiums from 20 rounds, just utter total dominance. And this year wasn't exactly bad, 17 Grand Prix wins from 22. It's a 77% win rate versus a 95% win rate, which is a considerable drop. But the caveat being that the last 5 races, most prolific winner, Marc Marquez, wasn't there. 2 less bikes. We can't forget that. Only 3 factory bikes instead of the 4. There are certain things there that just kind of mask a little bit the fact that Ducati is still really dominant. Despite what we've seen at the end of this season and certainly in the second half of this season.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, when you say, like, oh, it's a terrible year, you just won 17 Grand Prix. Like, my God, like, it's so, the standards are so high, Pete. But when you look at the contrast of the factory team, as Lewis says, they really get to see the best of Marc Japan and obviously Mandalika, where he get injured. And Mandalika was an all weekend because that's where he actually started struggling. That was more the track, and it was the first weekend you thought Marc Marquez looks like he's having trouble with the bike setup, and came off the back of a championship win, which you can say you want, he was tired. It just hit him all at once. But when he get injured, the stat that's crazy is that Bulaga comes in the Grand Prix from when Marc's injured. The factory team only scored 2 points, and Bulaga is the one who scores the 2 points in the Grand Prix over 2 separate weekends. Like, that's crazy, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a complete change, isn't it? I mean, okay, Bagnaia was unlucky, wasn't he, with Zarco? At
Valencia,
of
course.
But still, the bottom line is, on paper, as you say, that it's gone from sort of these perfect weekends to barely scoring points, and I think it's. The other strange thing is that for most of the year, even though Marc dominated, we didn't really feel he was actually pushing to his limit. It seemed like there was more left. So this is this sort of contrast between the other Ducati riders, or certainly the other GP25 riders, Bagnaia and Didier. You've got Marc dominating, but not dominating by sort of, riding over his head or sort of risking everything. It seems like he's got it under control, and yet the other guys are really struggling on it. And it was, I don't know, it is interesting that the race times, the way that in certain events, we saw this also actually, I think most recently, Portimao, where the sprint race, the race time was about the same as the year before. It was one of these seasons where the times didn't really improve. And we saw Alex Marquez fighting with Bears, fighting with Acosta. Great sprint race, wasn't it? They were all there battling away. And it was about the same pace, that sprint, as it had been the previous year, about 18 months earlier, because it was the start of the year. But then come the Grand Prix, Bez raises the level. They find something in warm-up, they raise the level. Suddenly Alex can't go with him because he's got to the limit of the bike, the speed that he can do. He tries, he knows he's going to ruin the front tyre, but he gives it a go. Mm-hmm. Sure enough, he runs out of tyre, has to back off, and Bez wins easily. So it is almost like there was this limit this year where the Ducati, it was hard for it to push beyond the 2024 race times. And when the other manufacturers were able to do that, that's when they had a harder time. I don't know, obviously tyres make a big difference, but there wasn't that much. Quite often this year we saw Michelin brought the same allocations as the previous year. Yeah. So, that's something that I think might be a concern for Ducati is, can they continue doing that? But certainly it's hard to know with the whole chaos at Aprilia at the start of the year, KTM as well. We now hear, there was all this talk of it's not the race program is not going to be impacted by the financial crisis. Now we're hearing words like, we was kind of 2 months without really being able to do too much of this. So they were set back, at the start of the year. And Aprilia were obviously set back by the chaos, having to reorganise with Martin being injured. So that helped Ducati a little bit earlier on, and then they came through at the end. It sets things up for quite an interesting time next year, when also, of course, we'll have a lot of Ducati riders with a very similar spec bike. The engine, we assume, will be the same, really, for all six. That's what we imagine. We don't know exactly. They could, in theory, homologate use the 24 again if they want, but presumably, because they're not having to design a new engine, they'll just give everybody the same engine. The GB26 will have different chassis, aero, that kind of upgrade, but certainly the bikes should be a lot similar. So it'd be interesting to see, with more riders on this bike, where do they go with it? Are they able? Is this a Bagnaia problem that's only for his style? Has he been able to solve it? Will we find something? Will he be back for next year? I think it sets things up for an interesting time next year when really you would look at this season as total Marc domination and think nobody's going to get near him next year. I think there are going to be question marks over the winter, as I think Ducati is saying it, aren't they? They're going to have to work hard. They're going to have to push and find more development, because their rivals have made quite unexpected gains, I think, when you look at the first part of the season. They've got a lot closer.
Absolutely, and it's not also the fact that, say, Aprilia are just getting with their factory team. It's the fact that Raul Fernandez was so strong at the end of the season, and you're building that army, which Ducati have had for so long, Lewis, with this factory satellite. Just, if it's not a factory bike, it's going to be the satellite team that's going to win. And I kind of think, in a roundabout way, that it kind of hurt Ducati for those 2 years with Martin being so good with Pramac, and the factory teams were just constantly just like on Pecco being like, it's all on you to win this. And it kind of felt like, hang on, are you just kind of going against each other? I thought it was all okay for Ducati won, which they did say, but you kind of always get the sense that the factory team, they wanted the factory team to win it, but it's like Mark kind of coming in and just re-establishing that, okay, I'm the man here. We could say Ducati had let him go somewhere else. They would have regretted it. That would have been a massive problem, but the army of riders that they have, it's really tilted on the factory boys now to be delivering for them. And as you said, like when Mark's not about, it's kind of a worry, isn't it? Because the others are so strong in their setups now.
Yeah, I still think that Ducati depth is what is a key strength that not many on the grid have. Aprilia always had a good end to the season, but I wouldn't put all my eggs in the Raul Fernandez basket yet. We're yet to see him really have a consistent season. We're yet to see Ayagura have consistency. We don't really know what Jorge Martin can do on the Aprilia. Aprilia goes into next year pretty much heavily relying on one rider to be doing the results, whereas Ducati can rely on Marc. In theory, if the problems that Pecco had this year is down to this ride height device, then if they develop, they know that they can develop a new one. In theory, they can dig Pecco out that hole, and we know that what Pecco can do. We know, from past years what he is capable of. So, at the moment, you still look at this year as being a blip rather than anything else for the time being. If it carries on into next year or for the first year rounds, then we reevaluate that. But Alex Marquez being on a factory bike, obviously he was so strong in the GP24 this year. He got on pretty well with the factory parts that he rode in the Valencia test from the sounds of it. I felt some of his comments actually were quite sort of damning for Pecco Bagnaia, honestly, because
100%. Yeah. What's the one? I don't want to know what his problems were, sort of thing. Is that what he said? Wasn't it?
Well, it was the fact he was like, I don't know, what bike I was riding or he was riding, but I felt great, and that's obviously what Ducati were looking for. They need more competitive, consistent riders on their factory bikes to make up for the fact that maybe Pecco might be off colour again. Digia is a good kind of podium rider, but he's not really, you can't bank on him to be fighting for a championship really. So I think that depth thing really does help Ducati still going into next year. Even with Marquez fully fit, obviously he's your top line guy. Here's the one you put all your kind of faith in. But if he drops the ball, you've got a good cast, there to kind of pick that up. And obviously I think now you're going into next year, that's Alex Marquez goes into that sort of second position really as being the next man up, in terms of who Ducati rely on. Like I said, I don't see this being a complete change of the guard coming into next year. Ducati, as Pete have said, will have to develop a bit harder. They know that. They think they understand what the problems were with this bike in terms of the ride height device. The engine, from the sounds of it, they've at least publicly been very firm that the engine is good, the one that they've used. So, that's assuming that the engine isn't the problem, that does make it a lot easier for them to develop something different to make the bike more competitive. And we talk about this GP25, and I think people have talked about the GP25 as being maybe a misstep for Ducati. Certainly it wasn't as big a step forward compared to GP24 to GP20, from GP23 to GP24, sorry, but it's the bike that won 13 Grand Prix this season in 2025. It dominated the championship with Marc. We've seen what difficulties Marc Marquez can have on a bike that isn't competitive. In his last year on the Honda, his riding style couldn't make up for that. Even then, he was still regularly finishing his top Honda, but he couldn't bring that to big results. So if the GP25 really was a bad bike, I don't think we would have seen the level of consistent domination from Marc that we saw in 2025, especially that run of 7 doubles in a row. That doesn't happen on a bike that isn't consistently good. So, I think there's this element as well, as a lot has been made about the bike. And yes, maybe it's not been the best Ducati. It is far from being the worst Ducati, though. It's probably still a better bike than the GP23, for example.
100% it is. It's way better. And people, if you listen to people on social media, they would tell you it's the Honda from 2022 that Marquez was riding this year. The way they make out that Ducati is. I mean, it's interesting the way Lewis brings up that misstep. It's a good point, isn't it? Because, I mean, it's such a good package as well. Like, if you even factor in them into podiums at the bike had, if you factor in Digia too, it's by far and away the clear bike to be on, isn't it?
The one thing that all three riders have agreed on is that the performance is there, isn't it? There's no doubt that as Digia, his frustration has been that almost from one day to the next, he can't keep it in that window. But when he does, he says it's an amazing bike. And that's what Marc's been able to do, isn't it? He's able to keep that bike hitting the marks every time, if you like, performance-wise. However things change, the grip, the conditions, the tyre compounds, he just keeps it in that performance window, which, as you guys say, is right up there. It's clearly, able to dominate when it's in that window. The other guys, for whatever reason, are not able to keep it there. And interesting also, if there is an element of the Ducati may be focusing on the 2027 bike. I mean, that could be a good move for their future. If they were able to see, let's say halfway through this year, look, Marc's dominating here. We're going to tick all the boxes. We're going to win all 3 titles. there's no problem here. Maybe we can, allocate a few more resources to the 2027 bike. I mean, that's only going to be a good thing for them in the future, isn't it? If they were being pushed a lot closer, you wouldn't be able to do that. And it's something that potentially we might see. I think we were speaking previously, John, weren't we, about other factories. If they're in the fight next year, they're going to have quite a difficult decision to make, aren't they? Do they put everything into the last year of the 1000cc era to try and get whatever they can as far as the championship and the wins and everything else? Or at which point do they say, enough here, we've got to look to 27 and put more of our engineers onto developing that bike for the future? Ducati are in that luxurious position, as you guys have said, of having the dominance, having the depth, where of any of the manufacturers, really, they can afford to move, I would say, sooner. I think the only question mark now is the early rounds of next year. They'll use that as a gauge, won't they? How do we still have, what's our level of dominance? Do we have enough of an advantage here? How much do we need to develop this bike? And how early can we cross over to the 2027 bike, which, again, if you're going to be a Ducati rider in 2027, you're going to be quite reassured to see that they're onto it early, aren't you?
Lewis?
Yeah, and just on that as well, I mean, I think one thing people have been comparing this year to 2019 for Mark, and you look at what he did on that Honda, but I think it's kind of worth sort of reminding that there was a lot of times Mark was beaten on that bike, in head-to-head fights. You think, Austria, Silverstone, there was lots of times where he was, on the podium, but he was still being beaten in head-to-head fights and being run very close, a couple of times run very, very close by a rookie, Fabio Quartararo, on an older spec Yamaha as well. We didn't really see that this year. There was, there was Barcelona, where Mark, at that point, when he was in such a position to win the championship, he, as much as he said, claimed, I'm still, foot on the gas, there was calculation involved. He wasn't going to go all out for no real reason when, he was second. Second was enough. So I think there's that kind of element as well to kind of give Ducati a bit of credence for the GP25, where, yes, we've seen Mark elevate bikes beyond their capability, but I would say if you kind of compare in 2019 and 2025, there was more occasions where you could see the deficiencies of that RC213V in 2019 compared to this year. At various points, particularly that stretch in the middle of the year when Mark won 7 doubles in a row, it didn't really look like that Ducati had any weaknesses, any problems that they came up against. They were able to find a way around it. And then obviously, Mark's talent, 100%, but the best riders do have to ride around these things. You can't be a great rider and not ride around any kind of issue with your bike. So, that combination married perfectly, and like I say, compared to a couple of years ago where Mark was certainly getting the best out of the Honda in 2023, but he wasn't doing anywhere near what he was doing on this Ducati. So again, there's Mark's talent and stuff, yes, he can ride around these problems, but you can only do so much if the bike isn't in a strong position. And ultimately, I think that's what Ducati's rivals need to be wary of going into next year, is that they don't kind of get lulled into that trap of, the GP25 wasn't quite the bike that it was the previous year. We were pretty close. We were able to, because you will get caught out. And as Pete says, if you're throwing all your eggs into the basket at the start of the year, trying to develop your way into getting a championship contender, and you don't quite get there to begin with, how long do you carry that on? Because there will be a convergence points where Ducati will ease off, and others will then see the gap shorten and go, okay, well, maybe a couple more tweaks here, we can get a championship here. There's a much longer game to play, and Ducati is really in the best position there. I think the gap that we've seen shrink is still quite a big gap.
Yeah, I was just going to add on the comparison between the bike specs and things like that. I think you can also look more recently, look at Mark on the GP23 and the GP25. I mean, Mark as a rider didn't change much, did he, in a year? Even physically, it's not like his arm was recovering still in 2024, and yet it took him quite a long time to win on that 23, didn't it? It took him until Aragon, and yet there he was with the 25, and total domination up until the injury in Indonesia. So I think that alone shows you the level that the GP25 was at, and the step that it was over the GP23. I think that has come from the bike. Like, I don't think Mark suddenly found something in his riding, if you know what I mean. I think Mark's at the level now at his age where he knows how to get the maximum out of what he's got. He was doing that on the 23, and it took him quite a long time to win, as I say. And there were other riders that said, I thought Mark would win earlier than that, and I think that shows how difficult that 23 was. And it also shows really the level of the 25. The 25 to 24, yeah, that's a lot more of a difficult one, isn't it? But as you guys are saying, you've got to put it in perspective. The GP25 wasn't way, way back in the list of, Ducati bikes. It was still a very good bike. And Mark's results, I think, prove that from coming out and dominating right from the start of the season. Even having that sort of disrupted winter, testing the different engine specs and all that, it certainly wasn't all to plan, was it? And yet, when it comes down to it and the red lights go out, he's able to win straight away from it on it and then continue, really, which he didn't do on the 23. So, of course, there was a bit of an adaptation to the Ducati, but I think that does show the step that the GP25 was at over the 23.
It's a good point that both of you make. I think the point you make about Mark not showing his full hand, and especially in that streak that he was in, it was just like, I mean, there was points that I can probably pinpoint 3 races out of those 14. The one where I was like, right, mate, you can have it. This is your championship. Is Sachsenring in the sprint in the wet? Where I'm like, did you really need to do what you done? And he just went, no, I'm going to win this. And it was like, even in the wet, it's like the marriage of that bike in him was just, he could have been so much faster. And in the Grand Prix, I mean, he built the gap up to like 6 seconds. And I'm convinced, I was like, just please try a wee bit harder. Because like, I want to see it go up to 10. And Assen was like that too, where he was defending, and I was like, the bike might have a bit more left, but how much does he have left? And I think, Lewis, that point you make about people getting lulled into the sense that Ducati might be struggling, yeah, I would think that if Marc Marquez wasn't around, you'd have a chance, but we've seen it in the past. Teams start to think, oh, we could potentially beat him this year, and then he just gets you on the Honda and he'll knock you out, and you're like, where did that come from? This is the point where it's the advantage Ducati have now, maybe the previous years. They have someone who's so supremely talented, even he probably doesn't know where the depths are sometimes, that this is the blanket for them, the cushion, isn't it, they have?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's a tolerance thing. It's, you have a certain window where the bike has its advantage over the others, but when that shrinks, you then rely on the rider to maintain some of that. So, and that's what they've got. They've seen the advantage shrink a little bit with the bike, but the advantage with Mark on it is still huge. And to get to a point where you can consistently beat him is going to be the real test for not only the manufacturers but the riders as well, his competitors, is how do you on a consistent basis fight Marc Marquez for a world championship. The only person that's done that in the modern era has been Andrea Dovizioso, and even then that kind of was a season of 2 halves where it started off not great for Honda or Mark, and then it picked up. But even then, he still ended up winning the championship by 37 points or whatever it was. Dovi didn't come into that final round really with the hope of beating Mark. It's nobody has on a consistent basis really. Rookie season, I mean, Mark really came from behind in that one, so you can't even really kind of use that one as an example. Nobody over the course of a season has gone blow to blow with Marc Marquez at the peak of his powers on the best bike, and even on the worst bikes in some cases, and beating him consistently to a point where you can run him for a championship. You look at Dovi, for example, you get, okay, took it to the final round in 2017, then look how massive the gap was the year after. And in 2019, 151 point gap in the space of 3 seasons, from when you went from pushing him to the final round in what was an odd season to being his nearest challenger, 151 points back. That's the thing, that there's a tough winter come. If you want to come and fight for the championship next year, you have to train harder than you've ever trained. You have to, work on the psychological side of it harder than you've ever worked. You have to really commit full blood, sweat and tears into next season if you want to have any hope of fighting an informed Marc Marquez on a factory Ducati for a championship, because so far nobody's done that ever. And yeah, okay, we've seen Aprilia come on, we've seen Bez be a really good bit of needle for him. We've not seen Bez in his mode in the last few rounds versus Marc Marquez. You know, are we really suggesting that the Marco Bezzecchi that won Portimao and Valencia could have put that performance in with Marc Marquez on the grid? Given that you only just beat Raul Fernandez in Valencia, I'm not 100% convinced by that. So, yeah, that's the thing, is that it's not just one thing for a manufacturer to get the bike there, but the rider's got to be there. And that's maybe the hardest thing, to prepare yourself for that type of fight.
Yeah, and it's actually the added element this year, even more going into the winter, as you say. His closest challenger is his brother. And how do you think Alex Marquez feels, Pete? He's been so used to seeing Mark beat others in MotoGP, and then it's been his turn, and he's went, Jesus, you're an animal sort of thing. Imagine your brother being that, and you're so close with him. And I think Alex even emphasised in interviews, and he's like, it's bloody hard trying to fight against this guy because he doesn't give you anything. Even the fact they're brothers, it doesn't change Mark on track. He'll be more cautious with his brother, but he'll still beat him if he has the chance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Alex knows that, doesn't he? From years of riding with him, training with him. I mean, I'm sure it's made Alex mentally a lot tougher, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Because he's had to go up against, the other riders go up against Mark on a Grand Prix weekend. He goes up against Mark in training in the week and for all these years as well. So, he knows that more than anything, you've got to focus on your strengths and doing what you can with the bike. And it's almost two different challenges, isn't it? As you guys were just saying there. One is to beat Ducati, but the other challenge is then to beat Mark. It's almost two different levels now, isn't it? It's not, you can't see it as one. I think previously when people were looking at, let's say, beating Bagnaia and Ducati, you almost grouped it as one challenge, didn't you? Where you go up against them as one. Now it's almost, well, you might have the best bike. Aprilia might have a bike that's better than Ducati, but that doesn't mean they're going to beat Mark next year, even if they were to do that, let's say, over the winter. So it's almost, there's two different steps now to the challenge, which is you've got to, it's almost the reverse of what we saw previously, where Ducati maybe had the better bike with Dovi, but Mark was still able to beat them. And that's what makes it so hard now, is when you have the best rider on one of the best bikes, and that's what the others are having to face now. And as you say, first among them is Alex, and it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? It's going to be interesting to see how he comes out next year. Obviously this year there was no expectations at all, was there? And he did very well in kind of keeping those expectations in check, even when everyone was saying, look, why aren't you winning, why are you finishing second all the time? He was good at saying, look, we're having an incredible season here, and didn't get too carried away with it when there was a lot of pressure on, you need to win, and the wins did eventually come, and it's been a dream year for him, really. But now he comes up to factory status. He's second in the World Championship this year, so he's the natural main rival for his brother. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out when it comes to, they've got to test together, they've got to share information, obviously develop the bike, and then they've got to ultimately race each other on the same bike. So suddenly that sort of difference that was there before of, well, I'm on a year-old bike, nobody expects me to do this. I mean, finishing second on a year-old bike, I think Morbidelli did it. I guess Marco Melandri did it. Those are really the only guys that have finished second in the World Championship on a year-old bike, not on a factory spec bike. So it really was almost a unique achievement that Alex had this year. But next year's a different year, and he's going to be on the best, and he knows that there's going to be extra pressure with that. And as you say, what will that change with the brothers? I don't think it's going to change too much, but for sure, Alex is going to. He's going to want to push. He knows he's got a chance now. He's earned this factory machinery. It's up to him to make the most of it, isn't it?
Yeah. And just before I come to you, Lewis, Pete says about that, why are you not beating him? I think back to those comments being like, oh, you keep finishing, you're at them win, you're finishing second, and Alex is like pushing my hardest here. It always made me laugh. It's like someone saying, say, prime Lionel Messi at Barcelona being like, why are you not scoring as much as him? It's like, okay, no problem. I'm busting my arse every week here, and you're like, oh, I'm not as good as the greatest guy who's ever, played the sport or done it. It's like, Alex deserved a lot of credit. And me and Pete spoke off camera last week when we recorded our podcast. Listen, I want to ask you the same question, actually. Alex got to see Mark in the same team environment in 24, and he's seen how he worked. And he understood, okay, this is what my brother actually does, because he never got that in 2020. He got it for one race and a couple of tests. Do you think that really helped him understand how to decompartmentalize the weekends and how to approach them? Because it certainly, yeah, he had the great bike and the great tools there, but the way he extracted them, it was very Mark like in the sense of how his weekends went.
I'm not sure if last year kind of molded that, because I would say it was kind of a different year for Mark in terms of adjusting to the team, adjusting to the bike, adjusting to winning again, and trying. It was very much a rebuild year for Mark. So I don't think anything that Alex would have seen from Mark in the Gresini garage would necessarily have been new to him. You know, he knows how Mark's work. He's been in the garage with him. He's been around him. He's okay at factory Honda. They weren't really teammates, but obviously Alex was at Honda for 2 more years after that. He saw the data. I think Alex is well aware of how Mark worked. I think he's kind of smart enough to know that just doing what Mark does isn't going to work. You have to beat Mark, you have to do your own thing. And I think that's what we saw from Alex, is we saw Alex doing his own thing. We saw Alex being his own rider. And I think for too long, Alex has sort of lived in Mark's shadow. You know, surname pressure is going to do that. But, Alex is, I remember a few years ago, after his first season, and it was still COVID time, so interviews were done over Zoom and stuff like that. And it was the start of the year, it was the LCR team launch. And I remember asking Alex, what advice were you getting from Mark in that first season? He was like, I was getting a lot of good advice, but there did come a certain point where I had to tell him to stop, because it became a bit too much. And I think that for me was quite telling in Alex's mindset, that he wasn't just going to just try and copy and paste what Mark did, and maybe that would work. Maybe you get a podium here and there, maybe you get a win here and there. I think we saw that when he made that move to Gresini. He wasn't happy at Honda. He wasn't really kind of forced out of Honda. If he wanted to stay for another year, he could have done. He just wasn't happy. The bike wasn't competitive. He wasn't getting what he felt out of it. So he made a change. And I think when Alex stepped onto that Gresini Ducati, we saw the beginnings of the Alex Marquez we have now. We saw him, riding a bit more confidently, just approaching things a bit differently, of which he's then built on for the past few years. And if there's one thing I think that he's maybe learned from that year with Mark, is that he probably did come into it with a little bit of a feeling of, I have to do my own thing here, especially because everyone is just going to be like, oh, well, it's Mark and Alex, he kind of as a package, whereas he wants to, he needs to prove that he can stand on his own 2 feet. And, we look what happened this year. For most of it, until he started winning, when he wasn't winning races, he was generally Mark's closest challenger in the first half of the season. In the second half of the season, he was the only rider to go head to head with Mark and properly beat him. We saw in Barcelona, and afterwards, when Mark was injured, we saw Alex generally being the Ducati rider, picking up the pieces and picking up the best results. And I think all that comes from Alex becoming comfortable in the rider that he is, not trying to copy Mark, not trying to be like Mark. He's trying to be Alex Marquez. And I think that's really the key thing here. And I think will be the key thing next year as well.
That's kind of what I'm trying to say. It's more in the aspect of the environment that was created last year. And I think, to Alex's credit, he's actually continued it with Gresini. The way the team is, they're so just, I don't know if they needed last year to really elevate them again, because they've been so good since they came back as an independent team in 22, Pete. I mean, you spoke to Michele Massini about Alex and how he's able to, his comments are precise, the way he's able to lead a team, and it's, you wouldn't have thought that. Personally, I'm not, no disrespect, I wouldn't have thought that from Alex, but it seems like he's grown a lot in 18 months, really.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's it. He's sort of learnt to focus on what he can control, sort things out logically in terms of the bike setup, that kind of thing. Not just get to sort of, not to panic. I mean, we've heard the word calm from him a lot this year, hasn't he? Let's keep calm, let's keep focused. I think he's done a good job of that. He's achieved what he wanted to achieve. We saw how when he got the title runner-up spot wrapped up in Malaysia, then he did that great race the next day in the Grand Prix. He had very clear goals. It was, get this achieved, and then we can push harder, take more risk in the race. He did that. And he won the Grand Prix in Malaysia as well. So I think yeah, Alex it's been really just a massive year for his career. Where everyone thought Mark leaving Gresini, well, that's it now. They've lost their star, right? They're going to sort of fall to the VR46 pick up the sort of official Ducati status. So in theory, Gresini's at the back of the queue, aren't they? They should have been third in line. Instead, Alex sort of picks up the baton, doesn't he, and runs with it, and suddenly they're up there, as you say, second best to Mark. But when Mark's not there or injured, leading the way and leading the challenges and taking the fight to him. So, yeah, exceeded all expectations, I think, and it is interesting that teammate dynamic of being next to Mark, isn't it? And Alex obviously had it last year, and just knowing that there's some things that you can learn from Mark, but there's others that you've just got to discard almost, haven't you? I mean, the data will tell you a lot of things, but it's not going to tell you the exact body movements that Mark's doing. So you can't try and sort of exactly copy. Oh, look, Mark opens the throttle there. I'll do the same, because you don't know what he's doing with his body to allow him to do that. There's no sensors that do that, is there? I mean, we do hear that Ducati are trying to measure more about the rider's body position on the bike, because that's kind of the last mystery of what's going on the bike. They can obviously know all the controls and things, but those sort of subtle movements that the rider makes, it's that's what's still special about the top guys at the moment. So Alex has learned not to sort of get too caught up in what you're missing and focus on what you've got, make the most of it, and move on. And as you say, for the Gresini team, just a great story, isn't it? For one of the smallest teams in the paddock, everything they went through with Fausto, and now here they are, second in the World Championship, and as well for the Marquez family, of course, have won too.
Yeah, best season since 2005 when you look at pure championship finishes for the riders and stuff. And yeah, it's the final question for you, Lewis, is, taking aside the factory team, Gresini and VR46 are essentially the same teams now in terms of parity of machinery. I mean, Aldegar's going to have a 25, Morbidelli will have a 25, Digi will have a 26, so will Alex. How crucial do you think that is for Ducati having the extra bike for data purposes?
Yeah, 100%. I think perhaps some of the reason why maybe we've seen that gap between Ducati and the others shrink a little bit is because of that loss of extra data from three bikes. They took that decision that rookie riders didn't really need a factory bike, which is fair enough, actually. I think Aldegar probably did benefit from being on a year-old bike. I think from Ducati's point of view, though, more importantly, it's about getting Alex Marquez on machine parity with the factory boys. I think they've seen
enough. Yeah,
they've seen enough now, and I guess there's maybe an element of maybe we made the wrong decision by giving it to VR46 and Digia initially. Maybe there's some of that. That Digia did a decent job at points, but he only narrowly beat Franco Morbidelli in the championship standings, and they're on two different bikes, and obviously Alex Marquez completely wiped the floor with a pair of them on a year-old bike. So I think there's maybe an element of that involved, that Ducati is kind of rectifying a mistake, perhaps. Which it's funny because Ducati, we've seen for a while now, Ducati's had this reticence to kind of lean on Gresini to give them a bit more factory parity.
Yeah.
It was a stipulation from Mark about his future, was that it's either a factory team move for me or I will take a factory bike at Gresini, and they said no. Where had they have done that, they'd have kept
a gold and silver livery this year.
Had Ducati had done that in the first place, Mark would have been at Gresini on a factory bike. Pramac wouldn't have left for Yamaha, so Jorge Martin stays in the Ducati fold. So if Pecco Bagnaia does have a bad season, at least then you've got Jorge Martin and Marc Marquez, as well as then, Alex Marquez and the performance he did. And so I think there's a little bit an element here of Ducati going, okay, we can accept that we've made a bit of a mistake in the past here. We're not going to repeat that. Alex has been too good. We can't waste that, particularly as well coming into a contract year. They know, Alex Marquez could be a very good option for them, whether at the factory team, whether at a satellite team on a factory bike. But they know that others on the grid will be looking at and going, okay, well, he was competitive on a Ducati. He knows the secrets of the bike. He can push Mark. other manufacturers will look at him as a good option. He's still young. He's only 29. He's got a lot of years left in him. He's only just coming into the kind of peak of his career in MotoGP. So, I think there are several elements, but from the biggest thing for Ducati is they need that runner-up rider on a competitive bike. Think back to Yamaha a few years ago. Franco Morbidelli, runner-up, top Yamaha in the championship in 2020 on a year-old bike. They didn't give him the upgrade for 2021, and he struggled. And we've seen that before. I mean, Yamaha, again, another example of Yamaha not guaranteeing factory machinery for Johann Zarco, even at Tech 3, and they lost him. And I think Ducati knows they can't play these games because they have lost good riders in the past through incorrect decisions. Think Jorge Lorenzo, for example, just a week or two before he won his first race, and really everything clicked for Jorge. They'd made the decision to get rid of him. It's Ducati have made these mistakes before, and I think they've now realized, okay, the quality of Alex is high. The value that Alex brings, not only in terms of results, but in terms of gathering data. Clearly, Alex and Mark working together on bike development is something that will energize the two of them, and potentially keep as a little sweetener there from Mark when it comes to contract negotiations going forward. So I think Ducati have finally kind of realized, okay, we can't keep making the same mistakes. We can't keep resisting. We need to be clever here, and I think from that there's that element involved as much as they get extra data and results.
You just reminded me there. I seem to remember Bagnaia actually warning a little bit when it became clear there was only going to be 3 factory riders, that he was a little bit concerned about not having that data. Obviously, Ducati were already cutting down from 8 riders to 6 this year, and also going from 4 factory bikes to 3, when you've got most of the rivals with all 4 of their bikes on the same spec. I seem to remember he was quite concerned when that first came up. So maybe Ducati did underestimate a little bit how that sort of drop in data would affect them. Who knows? And so maybe that is what they're correcting now with bringing in the 4th factory bike and potentially having all 6 bikes on a much closer level. So let's see if there is a big difference from that. But yeah, you did remind me there. I do seem to think that was something that was flagged up when it became clear that they were going to reduce sort of the factory bike numbers.
Maybe it's something they didn't think it was actually going to drop off. Well, maybe the drop in performance, they didn't expect that either. Maybe they thought the changes that we're going to make to the 25 were I won't need an extra bike sort of thing. But it shows when you do make something like that, you have to be 100% committed to it. And yeah, Lewis is right about the rectifying mistakes and getting Alex on board as a factory rider. It's needed, and it'll just be interesting in the early part of next year how Alex kind of approaches it, because now he has to go into not tester mode. It's a big winter for Ducati, and in the sense of the riders and how they approach it this year, because Mark's going to be Mark, and he's going to come back from injury, and it's going to be fine. Bagnaia is going to have to do a complete reset. Alex Marquez, seemingly from the first test, is confident, but then is Gian Antonio going to feel like Bagnaia? Is he going to be like Alex? Is it going to energize people, or to completely send them off in a different direction? That's what I'm trying to say, Lewis.
That's kind of the big question, isn't it? I mean, how all this impacts Pecco Bagnaia is, again, coming into a contract year is, we keep talking about 27, but it is important. It will be the first few rounds of the year. Winter testing is when all these things will kind of get laid out, and it does add the pressure on Pecco, I think, a little bit, having Alex Marquez on a factory bike, because if he goes on that and is competitive, and Mark remains competitive, and Pecco can't find his form again, you lose that benefit of the doubt of, oh, well, it was the bike, because at that point, you can't just solely rely on, okay, it's Marc Marquez and his talent. And that's not to say that Alex Marquez doesn't have talent to kind of ride around things as well, but the more your kind of theories get disproven, the harder it is to kind of justify the current level. So it's I guess you could look at, going back to your previous question, you kind of look at this, like I say, as a little bit future proofing. If this doesn't work out with Pecco Bagnaia, they're gonna need they're gonna need to keep somebody competitive within the stable somewhere. With and Alex Marquez could well be that rider, depending on term and stuff like that.
Yeah, I do think the market's going to change so fast next year. I think we'll get to who was it? It was Pat O'Neill saying on the broadcast that he expects it to be early and everyone's going to jump at it. So I don't know what you think about that, but I think it's true.
Well, I remember a few years ago when we had Yamaha announcing Rossi and Vinales, and
that's right,
and at the start of at the team launch, which at the time everyone was like, "Wow, that's early," and then Quartararo as well being announced as a factory Yamaha rider well before the start of the season, and there's nothing to suggest we won't get that, especially if teams are pretty serious about shutting down some of their top talents. Aprilia, for example, Ducati as well. Like there is that kind of thing of some teams will have their number ones in mind already, their priorities in mind, and if they can get terms worked out over the winter, why not announce it before testing even starts, because then that's the big element removed. Nobody's going to be asking about, what are you going to do with riders? We can't, we need to worry about data, blah, blah, blah. If you've got your number one guy, the one you want signed up, sorted, that removes a bit of stress from an already stressful situation looking forward to 27. So I can see a couple of riders being announced pre-season this year,
Mark being one of them, probably.
The team riders, and it's a 50-50 lottery, as we've heard about 27, but riders they don't have any time to wait to see what the bikes are like, because all that testing is going to happen behind closed doors, and it's all going to be hearsay. It's all going to be, I heard this, but I heard this, and someone told me this, I heard this. You're just going to have to look at the performance now, the technical team that these manufacturers got, and make your decision purely based on that. You can't really give any time to think, okay, well, I want to see what the first 850 lap times are, because it's not a conventional. It's maybe the most unconventional contract year we've had for
20 years, nearly, probably since 2007, maybe. Pete, what was it like then? Can you remember? Like, I'm not making it sound old, Pete, but I'm just saying, like Ducati kind of. They ended up with their fourth choice rider with Stoner, and it worked. Like, sort of that's the lottery, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a bit like, as you guys have been saying, what you tend to see, because of the unpredictability, you tend to get factories, they want to nail down one guy that they're absolutely certain of. So because they want the continuity more than anything else as well, don't they? Because you don't really want to change all of your bikes and all of your riders at the same time, because then you're throwing everything up in the air, aren't you? So as you guys say, the obvious guys to sign early, if you're a factory, you go for Marc. If you're Aprilia, you want Bez, and there's a reason from both sides as to why you'd want those deals done early, because it's working. Everything else, that then gives you the security of knowing that you've got one guy, you've got that continuity, and then all of the other things, you really just have to see how they play out. And you can take risks, as you say, you bring up the Sona example, that's the risk that you could take with the second rider, isn't it? But really, you want to be sure about your first rider. You don't want to take two big gambles on riders. So I think that's what we'll see is sort of factories initially being, let's say, cautious, or picking a proven rider, and then seeing how the pieces fall into place for the other choices in their team, which will depend, again, as you've said, on the current season, and sort of looking into the crystal ball a bit and wondering what's going to happen in the future. And let's not forget, even before that, when we get to the Sepang test, Marc Marquez is going to get on that Ducati, and he's going to decide whether all of the development that was done since Valencia and in those final rounds suits him or not. And that's also going to be an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, what happens if he says, hang on, guys, this has gone in the wrong direction? Maybe you'll say that. Maybe you'll say, no, I love it. You've made it even better for me. You've smoothed off the rough patches that I was dealing with, and now I can go even faster. We just don't know. It's going to be a long time he's been off a MotoGP bike, isn't it? And I think the Ducati engineers, they're going to be as curious as anyone to know what he thinks of the bike when he gets on it at Sepang.
Yeah, it will be interesting. And I don't know if both of you have seen the Ducati videos that they put out, the insight one. The last one's really interesting because you see Mark, what he's like when he's not. You don't see it all, but you see what he's like when he's not off the bike. He's really into meetings and stuff. He loves being involved. And like Nicolo Bulligan must be thinking, why is he standing there? Like, it must make you feel even worse. And it's like, Mark's a real details person and how he has everything ordered and structured. And what do you make of that, Lewis? His working sort of attitude when he's not on the bike.
I would play devil's advocate and say maybe suggest he doesn't fully trust the job of
Yeah,
Pecco and the factory riders on their own. You know, because you're relying on Pecco and Digia right now, two riders he absolutely trounced this year. You know, I do wonder if that's why he's made a bit more of that effort to be there, be involved in these meetings, because he wants to make sure that he's still having input, even not on the bike, because he doesn't, for what he says publicly, doesn't necessarily trust the job. Because obviously, you know, Pecco Bagnaia is going to go into testing this year trying to fix his problems. He's not necessarily trying to develop a better bike. He's trying to develop a bike that he can be comfortable on. Mark wants a bike that he can be competitive and can win the championship on again. And I wonder if that's maybe what we were seeing there as a, you know, maybe not fully trusting in his colleagues there to do or say the right things.
Yeah, him being there when he's not on the bike must have a lot of, it must get your head thinking, what's he doing here, sort of thing. But I don't know if it was like that at Honda. I can't really imagine, because he had so dialed in with that team that he knew he was the number one guy. But I always get the sense that even as he's got older, and it's interesting that he said in that championship interview that he'd done, he needed to be convinced at Qatar that he was going to win the championship, even though he had won 2 out of the whatever Grand Prix and won the sprints. And it's interesting as he gets older, Pete, how he is. He almost needs reassured every time now of his own abilities at times.
Yeah, I think it's just experience, isn't it? He knows that it's the full season, and just because you have a good start or you have one good race, or in the case of the Honda, sometimes a good test, there would be this sort of false optimism, wouldn't there? And they come back, they get into the racing season, and suddenly the results wouldn't be there, and there'd be almost this sort of shock. And he knows that you don't know where you are until you really get a big variety of races under your belt. And as you say, Qatar, because it wasn't a great track for him historically, etc., etc. So once he got through that and realised, hang on, you know, I'm still strong here, he really realised that there wasn't going to be any weakness for him, I think. And you know, on the point of checking in on the development, I mean, it just shows. Well, why wouldn't you? You've got to remember, all the riders really, they're part of a team, but they're there individually as well, aren't they? Yeah. And Mark has said many times in the past, hasn't he, when he came into Repsol Honda with Pedrosa, and there were parts that he liked that Pedrosa didn't, he'd push for those parts that he liked. You know, it's what all riders are going to do. You know, whether it's they're all there, they're not there to develop the bike so that their teammate does better on it. They're there to develop the bike so that they do better on it. And Mark's aware of that more than anyone. He knows that that's at play, so he wants to make sure, as you guys flag up there, that the developments, okay, they might help the other riders who are pushing for them, but wants to make sure it's going to be in his direction as well. And it must be a little bit frustrating for him to be sat there and not able to be part of that. You know, as a factory rider, that's what you do, isn't it? So yeah, let's see when he gets on the bike at Sepang if you know, he agrees with the way things are gone, or he pushes for another direction, which will also be an interesting one for the other riders as well.
Yeah, that point you make about the factory team and how he changes his direction. There's stories about Danny Pedrosa and Mark telling him, "Oh, that bit's great. You should use that in testing." And it wasn't. And Pedrosa would test it for a day, and he'd be like, "I'm not too sure." Mark's like, "No, I like it." It just throws them completely. I don't think he's like that now, but who knows? Maybe potentially he is. He's a fascinating character. But yeah, let's see how it goes for Ducati when we get to testing in 2 months, 2 and a bit months now. Jesus, it's coming around fast. I don't even want to think about it. That's the way it goes. But yeah, Ducati have got a lot of building to do this winter, but I'd arguably say, as Lewis pointed out, they're going into it stronger because they have a direction with Alex. They have Mark. They've got, I mean, Pecco should, if they get the comments that he's wanted and he's nailed it with the feedback, he should be back. And let's see how they go in 2026. But if you enjoyed this episode, like, subscribe, and comment if you're watching on YouTube. If you're on Apple, Acast, or Spotify, bell icon so you never miss an episode. And we'll see you next week for another episode.